Over the last few years, we've seen a decline in Windows users. And no, I'm not talking about the supposed 400 million people who left Windows, because that was actually just a grammatical error, really. But genuinely, people are moving away from Windows. This could be because a lot of apps these days are actually web-based, meaning that you could technically do a lot of the same things on your phone or a tablet, which means there are probably people out there who don't traditionally use computers. But if you're on this video, you're probably not one of those people. So let's talk desktops and laptops. When it comes to alternatives, a lot of people would think that Apple is probably the easiest alternative to Windows here. Essential word being easy here. But is that really correct anymore? Is that really the case? I don't think so. I'm far from the very first person to tell you that Linux is an alternative to Windows, and I can only imagine how many other people are discussing the exact same thing. But the public consciousness tends to think of Linux as this arcane black magic that only the craziest computer wizards could ever dream of using. But before we talk about where we are now, let's talk about how we got there. Let's say that you've watched a video from your favorite content creator, and he or she is showing you just how cool Linux is and all the wonderful things you can do with it. So you're sold. You want to jump ship, you're ready to go, and you go and find videos about Linux. You're probably looking for videos that are going to not only show you how to use it, but also things that are focused on your specific use cases, your apps, and how to use them. And this also assumes that maybe you're right down the middle as far as tech savviness goes. So you're not a complete beginner, but you're also not the sort of person who can write thousands of lines of code in half a second. So searching is easy. You find a video, a tutorial, great, this is exactly what I need. How do we do this? You click on that video, and the whole thing falls apart. You see this window. On Linux and Mac, it's called a terminal. On Windows, it's called a command prompt. And you see this tutorial, type in lines of code, and get so many more lines of code back. And it's this language that only computers speak that has nothing to do with any other language on Earth. Yet the person creating the tutorial speaks it fluently. So let's compare this to the experience on Windows. The idea is that, and I'm sure Microsoft would actually agree with me on this one, you should be able to use Windows almost in its entirety without ever having to use the command prompt. The command prompt is there specifically for troubleshooting and power users. And even then, for those groups of people and those use cases, you still don't need to use a command prompt entirely. So you're not interested in learning an entire language that only computers can speak. And you might arrive at the conclusion that you can't use Linux because you'd have to use the terminal for everything. So I guess it's back to Windows, or spending ridiculous amounts of money on hardware from Apple, which the same hardware in any other scenario, whether it be phones, tablets, or desktop PCs, hardware's a lot cheaper. So you have to pay the Apple premium for the same thing. And I do wonder how many people have had this experience, or how many people genuinely feel as if the Linux experience has been that because they've seen it in the past. And make no mistake, that kind of was true in the past. So if that's your idea of Linux in your head, well, I have some great news. You can use Linux today without ever having to touch the terminal. I know that sounds crazy, but if you don't believe me, I am living, breathing proof that you can do it. Years ago, when I started using Linux after being sick and tired of the absolute nonsense and pure stupidity of Windows, I had two major goals, two things I wanted to accomplish if I was going to make the switch permanently. The first was my PC was already replacing my console. So it had to game, and it had to game without losing any performance. I already had decent hardware for the time, so I didn't want to be losing performance for making the switch. And I kind of expected that that would be the case, because for all the Windows games that work on Linux, they do run through a translation layer. So my method was to grab another SSD. I actually bought two cheap SSDs, and I installed two different Linux distributions on them, inside the same PC with the same hardware, alongside my Windows install. So with these three operating systems going toe-to-toe, head-to-head, I benchmarked away. And keep in mind, when I tell you what the results were, this was a few years back, meaning that things have gotten a lot better since. So when I tell you that even back then, I was getting, if not the same frames per second or FPS in these games in their benchmarks, but sometimes even better performance just by sacrificing the overhead from Windows, that this was quite the feat. Especially, as I just said, it's running through a translation layer. It has an extra step, and it still is faster or on par. It's like your friend saying he's going to take a shortcut down a road, and you're on the freeway, and the freeway should be the fastest option, but you're stuck in traffic. And your friend took a shortcut that was almost twice as long and still beat you because of efficiency. And I tried both old and new games. Batman Arkham City, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, absolutely incredible performance considering the translation layer, which today is such a non-factor. Oh, and by the way, even back then, out of the box, there was no tinkering, there was no have to click on this or have to click on that to make these games work. These games were installed just as easily as I did on Windows. But we will talk about gaming a lot more in the future, because that was my primary reason for switching from console to PC. And I'm sure a lot of other people care about their gaming performance. What we want to talk about is how easy the rest is to use. And that was my second goal. I wanted to avoid the terminal at all costs. I did not want to ever have to open a terminal window to do anything that I could do through a graphical user interface or a GUI, which is the alternative and how we do everything on Windows and Mac OS, unless we're power users. So if I wanted an app to work on Linux and I went to the official guide, and the official guide said to me that I would need to open the terminal and run commands to get that app working, I'm not using that app. I was very strict with this. And you might think that the occasional line of code isn't a big deal. Or maybe you are a Linux power user yourself, and you think this is absolute blasphemy. But here were my main reasons for not using terminal. Firstly, if we go back to Windows expecting us not to use command prompts to do things in Windows by default, then we should be able to expect the same of a Linux distro if it's truly replacing Windows. And there are Linux distros out there which are targeted specifically at bringing Windows users over. Secondly, I really like the idea of keeping my PCs clean. That means that I like the idea of going through all of my installed apps and getting rid of the stuff that I don't use. So you can imagine how much I hate looking through my installed apps and seeing things that I've only used once, things that I've never used, or in the case of Windows, things that I never installed and Windows decided to install it for me. Yeah, not great. Whose computer is it again? So the problem with installing via terminal is that oftentimes you need to install multiple packages for the same thing. They're called dependencies. So app 1 needs 2 or 3 or 4 or sometimes 10 dependencies to get running. So it's not as simple as uninstalling that app. I'm not going to remember the exact line of code I ran to install it and all the dependencies, which means there will be leftovers. And sure, I can get a list of all my installed apps in the terminal as well, but I like keeping things simple. You can understand why I like Flatpaks. They install their own dependencies and they take their dependencies with them when they're uninstalled. And thirdly, this is the most important point. It was never just about me. See, if I'm the one getting all these pop-ups, if Microsoft's telling me with a full page advertisement stopping me from using my computer to use Microsoft's recommended browser settings, my goodness. If they're telling me that, then they're telling all my friends and family using Windows the exact same thing, except that not all of my friends and family are as tech savvy as I am, and they shouldn't have to be to use a computer in a basic way. Yes, they should have some understanding of computers, but when Microsoft does stuff like that, well, the only way to stop them doing that is to ask them nicely. No, it's to not use Windows. If I'm going to recommend Linux to a group of people with varying computer knowledge, from beginners to advanced, then that means it has to be easier to use than Windows. Just imagine this for a moment. Your tech support for your family and one of your parents calls up and asks for tech advice or support, and just in this case, let's pretend you don't have remote desktop because you're out and you can't remote in, whatever, you need to give that advice over the phone. If you have to explain to them a terminal command and then ask them what's on the screen, that is a very different experience to telling them to open a GUI or a graphical user interface. And when they're doing something in terminal, they're not necessarily going to understand what's going on. Not to mention that if someone was calling them pretending to be tech support, they'd probably tell them to do something in terminal as well. So we want them staying away from terminal. We want them staying away from things they don't entirely understand. But a graphical user interface, a well-designed one, will be very easy to understand and very easy to see exactly what's going on. So maybe next time when they run into that problem, they don't need to call you. But if they keep using terminal, they're going to have to keep calling you. So to answer the burning question, is Linux easy to use? Yes, it absolutely is. I have done the no terminal challenge since the very beginning, since I wiped Windows from my personal computer a few years back, and I've done so with every computer that I personally manage in my family and friends group. And do you know how many tech support calls I've gotten since? Almost zero, because it was so simple and straight to the point. And I'm not just going to say this and leave it. I'm going to prove it. All the videos I plan to do in the future, where we pick a Linux distribution and we go through every step of the way from downloading to installing to how easy it is to get a game up and running and other software, all of that will be with no terminal. So the no terminal challenge I did for myself will translate over to videos that I do about other Linux distributions. And if while using a Linux distribution, I am faced with a task which I can only do via terminal, that Linux distribution will lose points. And that's not to say that you shouldn't try and learn to use terminal if that's what you want to do. I'm sure there are plenty of power users out there on Windows who would absolutely love to know how to do almost everything in terminal on Linux. There's nothing wrong with that. But when it comes to using your computer for the most basic of tasks, when it comes to getting home from a long day at work, booting up your computer, opening Steam and playing a game, that process and maintaining one's computer with updates and basic web browsing, a lot of things shouldn't need terminal to get them up and running. So that is the challenge that I will be following for all future videos. Because at the end of the day, what it proves is that Linux is very easy to use. And if it's easy to use and enough people jump ship from Windows, can you imagine what a market disruptor that would be for someone like Microsoft? They might actually have to start trying for once.